It was a cold and windy night. The rain had not stopped for hours, and the wind howled outside like a restless spirit. But inside number 12 Willow Street, the little living room was warm and cozy. Old Mr. Carter and his son, Ethan, were playing chess, while Mrs. Carter sat nearby, watching them with a contented smile. "Ethan is a good son," she thought. "We waited so long for him, and he brought happiness into our home." Ethan was young and full of laughter, and his mother and father enjoyed his company. They were not wealthy, but they were a happy family. The two men were silent, focusing on their chess game. Outside, the storm raged on, tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. Suddenly, old Mr. Carter looked up. "Listen to the wind," he said. "It's a terrible night," Ethan replied. "I wouldn't want to be outside." "But isn't your friend Daniel coming tonight?" Mrs. Carter asked. "Yes," Ethan nodded. "He should be here any moment." "Not in this weather," Mr. Carter said, shaking his head. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Ethan stood up quickly. That must be him. Mr. Carter went to the door and opened it. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped inside, shaking the rain from his coat. "Daniel! Come in, come in," Mr. Carter said warmly. The wind rushed in, making the room colder for a brief moment before the door closed again. Daniel removed his wet coat and smiled. "It's good to see you all." "Come sit by the fire," Mrs. Carter said kindly. Mr. Carter poured him a glass of whiskey. "You must be freezing. Have a drink to warm yourself." Daniel smiled gratefully and took the glass. "Tell us about your travels," Ethan said eagerly. "You've been away for years." Daniel took a sip of whiskey and leaned forward. "I have seen many strange things," he said, "and I have brought back a story unlike any other." The Carters listened eagerly as Daniel began to tell his tale. "During my travels," he said, "I visited an old village deep in the mountains. There, I met a man who told me about a cursed coin, an ancient relic said to bring fortune and disaster." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "A cursed coin?" Daniel nodded. "It was no ordinary coin. It was said to grant 3 wishes to its owner, but every wish came with a terrible price." Mrs. Carter shivered. "That sounds dangerous," she said. Daniel took a small cloth pouch from his pocket and placed it on the table. A family leaned in, watching as he unwrapped it. Inside was an old golden coin. Ethan picked it up, feeling its cold, smooth surface. "It looks ordinary," he said. Daniel shook his head. "It may look ordinary, but it is far from it. The man who gave it to me warned me, each wish comes with consequences. He told me the last owner wished for wealth, but soon after, his family was destroyed in a fire." Mrs. Carter gasped. "That's horrible." Daniel nodded grimly. "He gave it to me because he didn't want it anymore. He said it was better if no one had it." Mr. Carter studied the coin. "And yet, here you are, with it." Daniel sighed. "I tried to throw it away, but it always seemed to find its way back to me. So I decided to bring it here and leave it with you." The room fell silent. After Daniel left, the Carters sat in silence, staring at the golden coin. "Do you think it's real?" Ethan asked. "Nonsense," Mr. Carter scoffed. "It's just an old coin." "But if it truly grants wishes, why not test it?" Mrs. Carter looked concerned. "What if Daniel was right? What if it brings bad luck?" Ethan laughed. "Mother, it's just a story. Let's try it." Mr. Carter picked up the coin. "All right," he said. "I wish for £40,000. Ethan and Mrs. Carter watched nervously. Nothing happened. They waited, but the room remained the same. Ethan smirked. "See? Nothing. It's just a story." They all laughed, but Mr. Carter couldn't shake a strange feeling. That night, he dreamed of fire. The next morning, The family forgot about the coin and went about their day. Later that afternoon, a man in a dark suit arrived at their door. Mrs. Carter opened it, smiling politely. "Good afternoon," the man said. "I'm from the Belmont factory. May I come in?" Mr. Carter frowned. "What is this about?" The man hesitated. "It's about your son." Mrs. Carter's smile faded. "Ethan? What about him?" The man lowered his gaze. "There was an accident." The words hit like a thunderclap. Mrs. Carter staggered back. No, that's not possible." "I'm terribly sorry," the man said. He didn't make it." Mr. Carter's knees weakened. Mrs. Carter fell into a chair, trembling. "No," she whispered. "Not Ethan." The man continued, his voice solemn. "The company wishes to compensate you for your loss." He placed an envelope on the table. Inside was £40,000. The house fell into silence. Ethan was gone. Mrs. Carter sat by the window, staring into the night. "The coin," she whispered. Mr. Carter turned to her. "What?" "We have another wish," she said urgently. "We can bring him back." Mr. Carter shook his head, horrified. "No. You know what Daniel said, every wish comes with a price." "I don't care," she sobbed. "He's our son." Mr. Carter hesitated, then picked up the coin with shaking hands. "I wish for my son to return to us," he whispered. They waited. Nothing happened. But then, a soft knock echoed from the front door. Mrs. Carter rushed to the door. Mr. Carter grabbed her arm. "No," he cried. "Think, what if it isn't really him?" She struggled. "It's Ethan." The knocking continued. Mr. Carter stumbled backwards, gripping the coin tightly. "I have to stop this," he muttered. His hands trembled as he whispered, "I wish for everything to be as it was before." The knocking stopped. Mrs. Carter threw open the door. The doorstep was empty. The wind howled through the empty night. They never spoke of the coin again. But late at night, sometimes, Mrs. Carter swore she could still hear the sound of knocking.